This spooky review is not about one movie, but rather three. Malevolence series, the Malevolence trilogy, which comes from Stephen Mena. And the series is really not what you would think it is. The very first movie is, you would think would be a slasher movie just based on what the concept is, but it isn't. It isn't just a pure slasher movie. The second movie moves in a completely different direction, and by the third one we're taken into where you would have thought it would have been to begin with. So it makes a really, really interesting trilogy. And it tells the entire story of the first one, sort of introduces us to the world of this killer, and the second one shows us how he got to be who he is by going into a prequel, and with the third movie you get sort of a resolution. I will say that it does end with a bit of a cliffhanger, so you don't know if it's actually a resolution or not. But the series is elevated beyond what a lot of horror movies are, and yet it still manages to be pretty darn scary. So we're going to look at each movie individually here and give you an idea of those. They're just now coming out on Blu-ray DVD combo packages for home video. So maybe this is something to pick up for your Halloween adventures. Certainly I very much recommend the first two movies. The third movie I recommend because it does complete the whole trilogy, but we'll get into the whole details of each movie shortly. First, let's take a look at the first movie in this series, Malevolence, just titled Malevolence, and this is the Blu-ray packaging. I'll get some photos of it and put those in interspersed with this stuff. So, it's actually a pretty darn interesting horror movie. It's a slasher film, but the director talks about trying to go for the Psycho sort of thing of having two different kinds of movies, and I can definitely see that. I'd almost say it's more from dusk till dawn, because you've got a couple some robbers who are trying to hide out until they can make their getaway. Problem is, the house they picked to hide out in actually is next door to a house with a serial killer history. And one of their hostages decides to run off to the other house to try to get help because they've escaped. And that sets off a whole chain of events that basically turns it into a slasher film. A bit like Halloween or Friday the 13th. The thing is, it's elevated well beyond any of standard slasher films. Yes, it's a B movie, but it's an incredibly well done B movie, and the acting is great. It just looks good. The story is a lot more complicated than you would think. Not in a bad way, not in a confusing way. It's easy to follow, but there are a lot of different threads going on, a lot of different little subplots, and the characters are all pretty well developed for this kind of movie. They go into a little bit of history on most of the characters anyway, and it's actually incredibly, incredibly well-told story. And yet, it still ties into the whole slasher film genre and really feels like it belongs as one of those. Interestingly enough, they filmed a lot of it in an old slaughterhouse, which the movie takes place in an old slaughterhouse. It's obviously, they've changed the backstory of the slaughterhouse and stuff, but they did film a lot of it in an old abandoned slaughterhouse, and it's just very creepy location. I will say that this Blu-ray collection, the movie looks good. It looks really, really good. But I also love the fact that they've got some bonus features. There's a lot of bonus features on the making of the movie that are highly, highly recommended. And I just, think this is one of the better slasher movies ever made. It's definitely up there with any of the greats, and in some ways it's elevated. It's like an elevated version of the slasher film. Highly, highly recommend this. Like I say, I'm going to take out some footage of me, put in some photos of the packaging and stuff, so you get the general idea. But I wanted to just talk about the movie itself, and that's the first one. We're going to get to all three of them in this video. For this section, we're going to talk about the second movie in the series, Malevolence to Bereavement. And this is a DVD Blu-ray package, which the other one was. I didn't actually mention that, but you can see it in the box. And I'm going to get rid of a lot of the footage of myself and put photos of the packaging and stuff. And this one, the other one sort of had a lot of people I'd never heard of before, but apparently Alexandra Daddario is actually pretty famous. I haven't seen her in anything else, but this was before she got famous. And there's also Michael Biehn in this movie. You have to know him, from Terminator and lots of other movies he's been in. In any event, this movie is actually a prequel to the first movie, and it sort of goes into details of how the whole serial killer family got to be there, and family's perhaps not the best term for it, but it's as close as you're going to get with me, because I'm not going to give away all the stuff as spoilers. Interestingly enough, it's a very, very different film. A lot of this film is more about the psychological side of things, the psychological angle of things. Don't get me wrong, it is twisted, it is dark. Both movies are very, very dark. But it's more about the psyche of the killer and the setup of that. To me, one of the things that's really fascinating about this movie is how the characters are so well developed, and you really wind up liking all the characters. They're very real characters, and you're very, very much afraid for them. You have a pretty good hunch, because it's a prequel to the first one, that bad things are going to happen to them, and you really kind of don't want that, because they're very good, very interesting, lifelike characters in a lot of ways. And again, they filmed it in the same slaughterhouse, so you've got the same scene, and it's still very creepy. There's some amazing, the acting is all just top-notch acting, and the production value is incredible. This is like a very well-made movie. I mean, they didn't do it on a huge budget, but boy, it sure looks like it in a lot of ways. Of course, horror and the general, gritty nature of the way it's supposed to look actually helps that. But, still, they do a great job of it. And then I'd also like to talk about, with the bonus features on this, you again get a look at the making of the film, and I highly, highly suggest watching that. It's well worth your time. It's a lot of fun, and you really get a lot of details that you'd never know about without having seen the or without having watched that, unless you really researched it or something. So again, this is a highly recommended movie, completely different from the first one in so many ways. Yet it still has the same tone, and it's still set in the same storyline. Perhaps it's more psychological thriller than anything else, but there's clearly the slasher aspect to it. It qualifies as horror in that aspect. So this is, again, another highly recommended film. You really can't go wrong with these movies. For Malevolence 3 Killer, the movies went in a completely different direction. And it's almost in the direction you would have expected for the first movie. It's just a straight-ahead slasher movie with everything you would expect from that. The characters aren't that well developed. You've got a lot of gratuitous nudity and sex, and it's exactly what you would expect of a typical slasher movie. The thing is, it's almost a disappointment in a way because you've come to expect better plot development and better characters and all that by the time you get to that movie. But I think it was almost an homage to that type of original slasher movie which inspired him in the first place. It continues the story. We take off, it literally begins where the very first movie ends. Like I said, the second movie was a prequel, so this takes over right at the end of the first movie, and it could almost be described as Martin Comes Home, because he literally leaves where he was holed up in the second movie with his abductor, and he heads home to where he originally came from and goes on a killing spree there. It's imaginative as far as the kills. It's got plenty of jump scares. It's a scary movie. Make no mistake about that. It is a scary movie. As far as slasher movies go, for me, some of the best parts are the lurking scenes. But if you go all the way back to the first Halloween movie, to me the lurking scenes are sort of the creepiest scenes of the whole bunch, where you can just sort of see the killer sort of behind everything, and you just catch a little glimpse of him wandering, or a shadow, or see him through a doorway. And this movie pulls those off pretty well too. There are a lot of those, and I'm a John Carpenter fanatic, and I'm a Halloween fanatic, so I've gotten used to watching slasher movies specifically for that, so maybe I notice them a bit more. I tend to look in the background of scenes in slasher movies to try to see where the killer might be lurking, and those things always kind of, I don't know, I just kind of really enjoy those things. So there's a lot of that there, and there are some characters that do get a little bit more development than others, and sort of build up towards people you don't really want to see get done in. The other thing is, it's again a Blu-ray DVD combo, and there are a bunch of bonus features. I was hoping for a behind the scenes that really had the producer, director talking about it, and everything. You get a behind the scenes, but it's more just a bunch of scenes collected while they were filming. There's no narration about what was going on. Now, my understanding is that during the filming of this movie, one of the main people involved died, and it kind of delayed the film quite a bit, and they had to do some rewrite. But I don't see any of that in the behind the scenes, and perhaps, you know what, maybe there was still some recovery from that, and some sense of loss there going on, so they didn't really feel like doing that part for this one. If that's really what happened, that's kind of a miracle that it got done at all. But in any event, don't get me wrong, this is a good movie. It's just not what you came to expect. And on the other hand, you didn't, after the first two, you really don't know what to expect. The first two were completely different movies too. And had this movie been the style of the first one, it would have been exactly what I expected. But I probably also wouldn't be as attached to this series. So that is the basic rundown of Malevolence 3 Killer. It's the slasher movie you would have expected for the first one, which is perhaps not quite up to the expectations that the other two movies built up within you after seeing them. Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.